Hi, welcome back to My Mom Life. If you're new here, welcome. I'm Jordan, and today we are making sweetened condensed milk bread. This bread is super fluffy and sweet and delicious. You're going to need some butter, also some cake flour. The recipe that I used called for cake flour specifically. We're going to need some sweetened condensed milk, some regular milk or whole milk, and then you're going to need some salt, 1 egg, and some instant yeast. So the first thing I'm going to do is mix up my flour with my salt and yeast. I'm just going to give it a mix with a fork, and then we will add in our wet ingredients. This recipe is super easy. There is 2 rising times. You're going to let the bread rise for about 3 to 4 hours total. So we'll do it one time and then we'll punch it down and then form our loaf and let it rise one more time. Just FYI, it adds a lot of time to making the bread, but it's so worth it. So I'm going to go ahead and add in the wet ingredients now, my egg, milk, my sweetened condensed milk. You don't need the whole can, just some of it. I will have the ingredients and recipe linked down for you in the description box. So I'm going to go ahead and get this mixed up. I did end up needing a lot more flour than the recipe stated, and you'll see here in just a minute why. So I'm going to go ahead and get it going in my stand mixer. I do end up kneading it by hand here in just a little bit, but I wanted to get it started in the stand mixer. So I have my dough hook, and you're just going to let this go and then scrape down the sides as you go, making sure that the flour is getting nice and evenly incorporated into the dough. And then once that is incorporated, we'll add in our softened butter. As you can see, this dough is very loose and sticky and wet. That is why even incorporating the 3.5 cups of cake flour that it stated for, I ended up having to keep adding flour little by little until I got to a consistency that I liked. I make bread a lot, so I know that it needs to form like a good ball for it to, a good dough ball for it to actually turn out. That's just my experience with making bread. So that is why I kept adding flour, because I know from my experience what the dough should end up looking like. So now I'm going to add in the softened butter. My butter was a little cold. I don't know if it was the temperature in my home that day, because I did let it sit out and soften for a few hours. But yeah, it mixes in fine. You want to add in 1 tablespoon or so at a time and let it mix in thoroughly, and then add in the next little bit. And I just let my mixer do a lot of the work for me. Like I said, adding in a little extra flour here and there, trying to get that dough to pull together. And then as I'm kneading it by hand, I'm also adding in some extra flour. So I would say a total of like 1 cup extra on top of what the recipe states. But like I always say, when you're working with dough and bread, the temperature in your home and the humidity where you live and your climate really can affect how much flour and liquid you need when making dough. So just keep that in mind if you try this recipe. It was so delicious. It reminded me of a really good brioche bread, the texture of it. It was beautiful. It was a beautiful loaf. So I'm going to go ahead and knead this by hand a little bit. As you can see, it's still pretty sticky and loose, so I'm going to add in some more flour here on my surface or on my countertops and on top, so that it doesn't just stick to my hands. It ended up sticking to my hands, but that's just part of it. I'm going to go ahead and fold it over on itself and just continue kneading until it forms a ball. And then I'm going to place it into a bowl that I have oil down in the bottom of, and then coat that dough ball with oil just to keep the dough from drying out and from sticking to the bowl. So I spent a couple minutes kneading the dough by hand, and it started to form this beautiful dough. So I called it good, and I went ahead and put it in a bowl. I have about a tablespoon of oil down in the bottom of it, and I'm going to go ahead and toss the dough ball in that oil, make sure it's nice and coated, and then I will cover this with a towel, put it in a warm spot in my kitchen, and let it rise for at least an hour, almost 2. Sometimes it just depends on how warm your kitchen is. You want it to double in size like this. Then we are going to punch that dough down, and we're going to roll it out into a rectangle. I have my loaf pan here greased really well. You want to grease your loaf pan really well. And then I'm going to take my dough, and I'm using my loaf pan as a guide, and I'm trying to keep my dough not any wider than my loaf pan, so that when I go to put this together, I won't have too long of a roll of dough. You'll see what I mean here in just a minute. So I have my loaf pan there as my guide, and I'm just going to roll this out into a big rectangle, and then we're going to roll it up as tight as we can, kind of like we were making cinnamon rolls. Now that I have it into kind of a rectangle, I'm going to roll it up. Like I said, you want to roll it as tight as you can, and then we are going to pinch it at the end, just to pull that seam together so it doesn't just fall apart. And you're going to see me pinching it here to kind of close that seam up. And then I'm going to put it seam side down and take a really sharp, mine isn't really sharp, but it would work better if it was, serrated knife. You could also use dental floss if you have unflavored dental floss. Just like cinnamon rolls, you're going to cut this into equal size pieces. So you'll see what I mean. See how my loaf is about the same length as my pan? That's what you want in the end. So that's why I was trying to use it as my guide. Now I'm going to take my knife, and I'm going to cut pieces of dough, and I want about the same size pieces, and then we will put these in the pan, and then we're going to let this rise one more time. I kind of squish them together a little bit. It just helps it fit into the pan nicely that way. Not too much, you don't want to totally deflate it, but here is what it should look like in the end. Now I'm going to cover this once more, let it rise for another hour to hour and a half. And once that time is up, I'm going to go ahead and get an egg wash ready, which is just 1 egg and a splash of milk. I'm going to whisk it up with a fork, and then I'm going to brush it on top of my loaf. My oven is preheated to 350 degrees. We're going to end up baking this for about 40 minutes, depending on your oven. You could check it at about 35 and see what it's looking like, but you will see once mine is done what it should look like. It should be nice and brown on top. This egg wash is going to really help the top of this loaf get nice and golden brown. As soon as my dough was done baking, I let it cool, and then I took it out of the pan. It was super easy. I just took a knife and went around the edges, and then it popped right out. So definitely grease your pan really well, and it should come out no problem. And this is what it looks like. It is so beautiful and golden brown on top, but it is so moist and delicious on the inside. I promise. I I show you at the end what it looks like on the inside. Now I am just making the glaze. So this is 3 tablespoons of sweetened condensed milk with 1 tablespoon of butter. I'm gonna go ahead and microwave this for just a few seconds just to get that butter incorporated fully, because my butter, even though it was soft, was not mixing very well with that sweetened condensed milk. So I just nuked it in the microwave for a few seconds and it came out perfect. And then I'm gonna take my clean pastry brush. I cleaned it from doing the egg wash from before. And I'm gonna brush this glaze on, and I used every drop of this glaze. You just wanna keep going over it and liberally apply the glaze because this is so good. So just be patient and keep brushing the glaze on. It's worth it. And I'll show you here what it looks like when it is all done. This is what the finished sweetened condensed milk bread loaf looks like. Is it not beautiful? I seriously was so proud of myself. I think it turned out great, and it kind of pulls apart on its own because you have those sections of bread the way that you put it in the pan. But it turned out so good. My whole family loved this bread. If you try this recipe, please leave me a comment and let me know what you think. And if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're new to my channel, I would love for you to subscribe and stick around. And I'll see y'all in my next one. Bye, guys.